After a successful decade run as a feature documentary, Eyes of the Mothman is now a podcast containing bonus information and, for the first time ever, the complete, unedited field interview tapes with eyewitnesses, experts, and those who were directly impacted by the Mothman incidents that occurred in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in 1966 and 1967. Although this podcast is meant to act as a historical record and an archive of the events that transpired, all material contained here is not for reproduction without the written consent by the copyright holder, Redline Studios, Incorporated. Episode 19 of Eyes of the Mothman, the podcast, takes a look back at our raw interview with Susan Sheppard, paranormal investigator, psychic, and Woodrow Derenberger expert. Remember, we interviewed her up in Parkersburg, which we didn't get to spend a lot of time in Parkersburg. I believe it's about 40, 50 miles north of Point Pleasant. You know, has its place in the Mothman story, but at the same time also is kind of divided in its own little story itself. This was like that whole separate incident that was going on where there was a man who started to come forward with claims that he was having like a full-on friendship with an extraterrestrial with very, very constant ongoing stories. And it just got to be this kind of like almost Terry Gilliam style, like crazy story of a guy who befriends an alien and can communicate with him.
This is the thing that we shot in the courthouse. The story, right? With Justin being Woodrow Derenberger?
No, this is the one where we shot him in the reenactment where he's in the truck looking over his shoulder.
Oh, that was, what's his name? What was the guy's name that played
Todd.
him?
Todd, yeah. He's great on camera.
It's funny. Yeah. Again, going out there, we like did not have a lot planned. And then we started to go, oh man, we got to start shooting some recreations. We're like, who's going to be Woodrow Derenberger? And then Todd, who had worked at the Mothman Museum, just like was, a big fan of Mothman. Obviously, if he's working at the museum. And just looked great. I remember he had an interest in acting. We're like, you're our Woodrow Derenberger. And he was perfect. He was a really good actor.
I mean, he looked like somebody plucked him out of the Great Depression. He just had that face.
Yeah.
And his face was just so dynamic and it was great, such character to it. And again, in the middle of the darkness, I think we have a generator?
We did, yeah.
We had a generator and we had, maybe 3 or 4 lights. And we had to light the scene, with the reflection, the rearview mirror, and again, we got a vintage truck as well, didn't we? Where did we get that?
From the car club.
Yeah, we had a car club who found out we were in town and just donated cars to us.
I remember they had a 50s Chevy, like a 54 Chevy 210 or something like that. And
it was a beautiful red truck, and it popped in the darkness.
Yeah, and they really, people who have vintage cars, they love to show them off. So when they find out that they're going to be in a movie and they're going to be, I'm sure they were telling everybody.
The weirdest thing in all of this and most fascinating is the Woodrow Derenberger story. And the reason I mention this is that's kind of how we became friends with Susan and how she became part of our film, because she was one of the few people who was kind of like an expert in that story. Susan lived in Parkersburg. She was a psychic who did like kind of haunted ghost tours around Parkersburg. And she was very, very knowledgeable on the topic of Woodrow Derenberger. She knew their family. There were tapes of Woodrow Derenberger that Susan had access to, audio tapes of Woodrow Derenberger's kind of confessions and discussions about his experiences with Indrid Cold. And the thing is too, when you talk about this stuff, you go, oh man, this sounds so bizarre and just so kind of like far-fetched. But what people have to remember is back then, for as weird as it sounds, the United States Air Force took it seriously. They came and interviewed Woodrow Derenberger. They brought him down to Florida for like a full interview with him. So the government absolutely took his story serious and his allegations that he was seeing and witnessing UFOs and interacting with extraterrestrials.
Were you in touch with his daughter as well?
Yes. For a while, I was in touch with Woodrow Derenberger's daughter. She remembered all of the incidents. She remembered him going down to Florida and having these like interviews. And like he had a very detailed journal and diary that I was able to kind of review and go through and use as like source material. I didn't film it and put that in the movie that way, but I was able to go through his like manuscripts and his writings. Like he kept a diary and I was able to use a lot of that. It was a very weird story, and Susan's role in the film was predominantly to speak on behalf of the Woodrow Derenberger story and what that was, because she was the closest person that we could find to it. outside of Woodrow's daughter, who at the time did not want to be filmed and be a part of it. Because again, much like we talked about Merle Partridge in the other episode, the Derenberger family, it's like they weren't celebrated and, handed a television show after talking about their experiences with abductions and aliens. They were ridiculed and people would bother them and harass them and hang outside of their property. And if, I do remember from our film and the retelling of the story that, this was the incident where this guy was talking about UFOs always being over his house. So people started like hanging out in his yard and camping out. Like people were like looking to latch onto this, and it kind of brought him more trouble than it did, fame. I mean, they eventually had to leave the area and move away.
Do you know what was first? Was it Merle Partridge had spotted? Did he spot things before Derenberger spotted things, or was it kind of just all happening at the same time?
I believe Partridge was first, and then the Derenberger incidents were later. It's been a long time, so I could be getting that wrong. But it's almost kind of like, from what my recollection is that these two things were happening separately and never really connected until later when people went back and looked at this and goes, well, wait a minute. While Mothman was going on, here with all of these very specific stories, this Derenberger incident with this one person and these UFOs and aliens were also happening very close proximity, but kind of like in its own thing. I don't even know if they were aware of the two incidents happening at the same time in conjunction with one another. But I think looking back and as people started to investigate these stories, they started to realize that these two things were going on at once, like parallel. Remembering Susan in her interview, for me, it goes beyond the interview. Like, she was a very nice person. She always kept in touch with me. Confession, like, I always thought Susan was cute. I really did. Like, I always thought she was like a very cute woman. And she was very pleasant. And we she would go out to dinner with us when we were in town, in years after filming the documentary. Just very welcoming. And she always made us feel very comfortable. And I think she went out of her way to make us feel like we were kind of not outsiders. We did film like what we kind of called like a psychic walkthrough with Susan, where she kind of walked through the town and gave her like impressions and vibrations about like what she was experiencing as, someone with psychic ability. And I know we were all kind of like slightly skeptical. We've done stuff with psychics in the past, and you're always kind of going like, what is the real story behind this? But I do remember, I don't know if you guys remember this, when we did our walkthrough, we walked through the town, and when we went to the Cornstalk monument where his resting place is, she was talking about Cornstalk, and she put her hand on the tomb. And as soon as she did that, it zapped all of the electronics and killed her microphone, and we had to stop down and replace all the batteries. And I always thought that was kind of a weird thing, coincidence or not.
I do remember that. I remember there was some weird, I don't know I can't remember exactly what had happened, but I remember during her interview or during the walkthrough, there were like weird electrical things happening. I
know that it was important for her that we do a good job with our film because she had been involved with the local community in the town in the years following. And she was one of the kind of early people who would contribute to the Mothman festival. Just like Chad Lambert was one of the first key speakers in the early Mothman festival, Susan was also one of those people. And so she's kind of like, I look back now, so much time has gone by, but there's like the Mothman OG people. Like Chad Lambert is one, Denny is one, Walmsley is one. Susan is definitely one of those people. She was one of those people who was always at the festival, always there, always willing to talk, speak, lecture, and help. And she helped our film a ton with information on camera, off camera. The film would have not been what it was without her help and contribution. So I definitely, remember her fondly. And I do really look forward to now revisiting her original field interview tape. So here it is with psychic and Woodrow Derenberger expert, Susan Sheppard.
Okay. My name is Susan Sheppard. Sheppard, and I live in Parkersburg, West Virginia.
Okay, great. So I'll just go through some of like kind of the some kind of things just that always make the interview go better. Just I guess points or whatever. So just talk to me as if we're kind of just having a conversation, and if the camera's not here, it always looks better. And then I'm going to ask you a bunch of different questions. Later on, when I go to use it, my question's not going to be there. So if you could try to like restate my question in your answer, that really sounds nice. And that way it kind of places it where if I say like, what happened to Woodrow, and you just say, he got scared. later on, all I'll have is he got scared. But whereas if you say, Woodrow Derenberger was scared, it's kind of like a complete thing that we know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I might ask you the same question more than once. If I do, it means I'm trying to get multiple answers to pick from later and things like that. And I think that's it. The rates follows up. And if I ask you anything that doesn't make sense, it's not like your area.
Yeah.
Just tell me and we'll skip it.
There's a couple of things, though. I don't know if I told you about. I did have some experiences as a child related to the Mothman and the Partridge sightings. I don't know if I had talked about that with you.
I didn't, so I don't ready for that, but I'll ask you that.
Yeah, I'd love to, because we have there are a few things that happened. And so there's some interesting stories with that even predated 1966.
Okay, what I'll do is I'll ask you everything I've got prepared.
All righty.
Stuff that I didn't know.
Okay.
We'll just, we'll go over in the end. Okay, what did I miss? And then we'll.
All righty.
The other. Okay, the first question I'm going to ask you is about the Men in Black. A lot of people in Point Pleasant were seeing strange and unusual things, lights and Mothman and all that stuff. But then, afterwards, there were even some weirder things going on. They were claiming that they were being confronted with what people call the Men in Black. Can you just tell me about some of these cases that were happening in Point Pleasant? What were these Men in Black doing in town? What were they telling the residents and witnesses?
Well, during the time of the Mothman sightings, there were cases of the Men in Black in Point Pleasant as well as other places in West Virginia. Some of the earlier sightings of the Men in Black happened to a UFO researcher by the name of Albert Bender. And he and Clarksburg writer Gray Barker were some of the first people that began to write about this particular phenomenon called the Men in Black. And generally, what happened with the Men in Black that happened in Point Pleasant and also here in the Parkersburg Mineral Wells area is UFO and also Mothman witnesses after they would have their sightings of UFOs or their encounters with the Mothman, is they would soon be visited by these strange men completely dressed in black who would come to these people's houses, and they would begin to interrogate some of these witnesses and ask them questions about these sightings of unidentified flying objects and also the Mothman. And they would begin to make subtle threats toward these people, how they shouldn't really report these tales. And some of them would act very strangely. They would act like they didn't know how to use, for instance, ballpoint pens or kitchen utensils. Some of them would have a slightly Asian appearance. They would not be, and they would be entirely dressed in black. They would show up in cars that were late model cars, say from the 1940s and 50s. But the cars would look entirely brand new. Sometimes they would seem to be extremely naive and stupid. They would make ridiculous comments. Sometimes they would even talk about events that would later happen. They would make predictions of events that would later happen. And generally, when they would talk about these things, the people would become extremely frightened.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the Indrid Cole questions, and that's pretty much what I'm going to talk mostly about with you. That
I would love to.
Can you just tell me, you had you've kind of studied and had a part in the Woodrow Derenberger and Indrid Cole kind of case. You've kind of studied that for a while. Can you just tell me, how long have you been studying that?
I first heard about the Woodrow Derenberger, Indrid Cole story as a very small child. It was quite a case here in Parkersburg. The event actually happened on November 2nd, 1966, when a local sewing machine salesman by the name of Woodrow Derenberger was driving home from his job in Marietta, Ohio, toward his farmhouse in Mineral Wells, West Virginia, when he was stopped along the highway by a spaceship. He thought, as he was coming around the bend, he thought that there was a tractor-trailer truck coming up on him at a very high rate of speed. he pulled over to the side of the road in order to avoid this tractor trailer, which he thought was going to actually push him off the road or actually come into the back of his truck, when it seemed like the truck went up into the air and completely rolled over Mr. Derenberger's panel truck. Mr. Derenberger brought his truck to the side, and the craft completely rolled over his truck, went over to the side of the road, came down, hovered about 12 inches off the side of the road. A man stepped out whom Mr. Derenberger described as looking like any ordinary man you would see on the street, walked toward Mr. Derenberger's truck, began talking to Mr. Derenberger, and said, "Do not be afraid. I have not come to harm you. I only want to ask you a few questions." And that is when Mr. Derenberger became afraid, because as the man talked to Mr. Derenberger, his lips did not move. And later, this man introduced himself to Mr. Derenberger as Cold, Indrid Cold. There's a lot more to this if you want me to go into it. I mean, I've got the story down.
Okay, yeah. If I miss anything, like I said, I have a bunch of questions for you. If I miss anything.
All right. If you want me to continue with the way I tell this, I mean, I'm used to telling the story. Do you want me to go ahead?
Well, I had what I've done is I've kind of like outlined the whole story and broken down certain questions so I can keep coming back to you. But let me run through everything to make sure I hit the points.
All right. Okay.
If I miss anything.
Because there's a lot of stuff that happens. Like he says, Indrid Cold points toward the lights of Parkersburg and says, what is that? That's Parkersburg. The cars are passing under the craft. The craft shoots back up. It's raining. The cars are passing under the craft. They can't see it. Anyway.
Okay. Yeah. Those are all things. I mean, some of them I have, some of them I know I don't.
All right.
But I think, if I go through what I have,
all right. Okay.
it'll be obvious what I think.
All righty.
Can you tell me what type of man Woodrow Derenberger was before his, kind of extraordinary experiences? And then tell me what started to happen to him without going into the details, just like, without going into like specifics of what was happening to him, but just more along the lines of like communication with, higher beings. So just tell me what he was before this happened. What kind of man was he? How was he known? And then just if you can start to just kind of allude to what these kind of extraordinary experiences.
Mr. Derenberger was a commonplace Appalachian. If you listen to tapes of his voice, he has a very strong West Virginia accent. He's a little bit difficult to understand, maybe to you, as you've listened to some of these tapes. He worked as a common sewing machine salesman. He had worked as in the different plants here in the area. He was a deacon at his church. He was a regular guy. There was nothing extraordinary that ever happened to Mr. Derenberger until he met on a lonely November night, 1966, when it was misting a light rain, and he was stopped by this alien being who introduced himself as Indrid Cold. Nothing extraordinary had ever happened to Mr. Derenberger up until that night of about 7:30 in the evening, November 2nd, 1966, had ever happened to Woodrow Derenberger before, until that night when his life was completely transformed. And basically, to tell you the truth, his life was ruined after that time.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a similar question at the beginning part. Can you tell me a little bit about Woody before the extraordinary experiences? You don't have to go through touch on some of the things you touched on. And can you also just tell me, like, how did people view him in the community? Was he well respected? Was he, how did others view him in the community that he lived in as well?
Well, his family had lived here for a number of years. They'd been in the Wood County area for at least 150 to 200 years. They were common farmers up until the early 1900s, where they worked in the plants and, had jobs in the area. They were conservative Christians. They were of German descent. And he was just looked upon as your everyday guy. He did not drink at all. I don't believe he'd ever been to a psychiatrist or psychologist. He'd never had any problems with his nerves. He'd never taken any kind of nerve medication. He just was a normal everyday guy with a wife and 2 children.
Right. No, I think it's 14 days before the first sighting that I document in my project. 14 days before the first kind of Mothman sightings start to pop up in Point Pleasant. And Derenberger has his first encounter with Indrid Cole. Even though you've already gone into it, can you tell me a little bit about the first encounter and tell me about the first encounter, especially how kind of like the details of his story add a little bit to the credibility. Like, someone who makes up a story may have made it a little better because his wasn't that extraordinary. If you can start it with, 14 days before the Mothman sightings even start to pop up in Point Pleasant, Woodrow Derenberger has this experience.
Well, I think that's one thing that adds credibility to the story of Woodrow Derenberger is it did happen 14 days prior to the first Mothman sighting. And one of the reasons that the Woodrow Derenberger Indrid Cole story ended up in the Mothman Prophecies book is that when John Keel was in West Virginia at the time, he heard about this story about Woodrow Derenberger. So in a sense, that helps lend credibility to Mr. Derenberger's story, and that is he didn't make it up later. This extraordinary event happened prior to the first Mothman sighting. And so it was already happening. And this incredible tale that unfolded in this area, which was about, I would say 50, 60 miles as the crow flies from Point Pleasant. And in many ways, the only reason that these 2 stories are linked is simply because of how close they are to each other. And they both do also involve these characters, the Men in Black, because after the Indrid Cole visitation or encounter with Woodrow Derenberger, the Men in Black did visit Mr. Derenberger at his farm, and Mr. Derenberger had never heard of these Men in Black, and he thought they were spies, and he was spies, and also maybe from the mafia, and he was extremely frightened of the Men in Black. He didn't look upon them as aliens at all.
I'm going to ask you something similar. Without going into Keel's book, if you can.
Okay.
Something similar, but if we could start this time, I'm going to ask you kind of, if you can go into the story again of what happened to Woodrow Derenberger the first night, and tell me as if you're telling me for the first time, as if I'm someone who's never heard the story.
Okay.
But if you could start it with, to put it in a placement before the Mothman sightings, if you can start it with, 14 days prior before Mothman sightings start to emerge in Point Pleasant, a man, Woodrow Derenberger.
Okay. Okay. 14 days prior to the Mothman, November 2nd, 1966, Woodrow Derenberger was stopped on Route 47 and I-77 near Parkersburg, West Virginia, by a craft that came down in front of his panel truck. The spacecraft came down, hovered about 12 inches off the road, and a man stepped out whom Mr. Derenberger described as looking like any ordinary man on the street. He was approximately 35 years of age. He had an olive complexion, dark brown hair. He was wearing a long, dark trench coat. The man began walking toward Mr. Derenberger's truck. He said to Mr. Derenberger, "Do not be afraid. I mean you no harm." He walks toward Mr. Derenberger's truck. He looks into the window at Mr. Derenberger. He says to Mr. Derenberger, "Roll down your window. I want to talk to you." And when Mr. Derenberger looks at this man, he realizes his lips are not moving. At this point in time, Mr. Derenberger becomes extremely frightened. He does roll down his window. The man points to the lights of Parkersburg and says, "What do you call that?" Mr. Derenberger says, "Why, that's Parkersburg. We call that a city." The man then says to Mr. Derenberger, "Where I come from, we call it a gathering." This man, who is approximately 35 years of age, 6 feet tall, later introduces himself to Mr. Derenberger as Cold, Indrid Cold, whom he interestingly describes as a place not as powerful as yours. He begins to have a conversation with Mr. Derenberger, and later Mr. Derenberger begins to say that he feels that Indrid Cold is really not interested in any of these questions he's asking Mr. Derenberger. What he is really interested in is holding a communication with Derenberger. Later, after the conversation, Indrid Cold says to Derenberger, "Mr. Derenberger, I thank you very much. I will see you again." After Indrid Cold says this to Derenberger, the spaceship, which has been hovering about 25 feet in the sky, comes back down. Indrid Cold walks back toward the spaceship. A hatch opens. A human arm extends, pulls Indrid Cold back up into the spaceship. Once again, the spaceship goes up to about 25 feet into the sky, flies away at a very high rate of speed. Mr. Derenberger finally... Okay. I'll stop a minute. Okay.
You said...
Let's see. Where am I? Flies away at a very high rate of speed. Mr. Derenberger drives home to his farmhouse in Mineral Wells. He is met at the front door by his wife. She says to him, "What has happened to you?" And later, Mrs. Derenberger says that Mr. Derenberger could not have been any whiter if he had been lying in a coffin. Mrs. Derenberger goes in and calls the West Virginia State Police, and she reports this encounter with the UFO and Indrid Cold. Not Mr. Derenberger. Mrs. Derenberger does. The next day, Mr. Derenberger's life is transformed. Can I wait a minute?
Sure.
Okay, let me gather my thoughts here.
Sure.
How was that?
It's going fine.
Okay, wait a minute. I'm not telling it as well as I normally do.
It's okay, because I'm going to probably chop it up and come back and forth.
Okay, let me think here.
Probably gonna be-
I mean, it's a long story.
Yeah.
Let's see, because I've forgotten things. Okay. I'll go into what happens next the next day. Let's see here. Because there's so many things that happen. I'm sorry.
Sure.
A million things. Okay. You want me to start?
Yeah, we've gotten up to the next.
Yeah. The following day, Mr. Derenberger is not able to go back to his job in Marietta, Ohio as a sewing machine salesman. He is interviewed on live TV.
Or just remember to talk to me.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Want me to do it again?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Let's see. The following day, Mr. Derenberger, wait a minute. The following day, Mr. Derenberger tries to go back to work in Marietta, Ohio as a sewing machine salesman, but he's not able to do this because by this time there's a media storm, and he goes on live TV here in Parkersburg, West Virginia, where he is interviewed by the state police, the Wood County Airport, the city police, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base from Dayton, Ohio. They're sending in some representatives. All these people are coming in to interrogate or ask Mr. Derenberger about his encounter the previous night with this alien being named Indrid Cold, that he stopped by this this spaceship. And it's quite a media storm. I mean, it makes all kinds of headlines, and this event goes all over the world. In fact, there's some GIs, or there's some servicemen in Vietnam. They're in Vietnam, and they're listening to the radios. They're from Parkersburg, and they're in Vietnam, and they hear this story from Parkersburg, West Virginia, about this encounter with this Indrid cold with Woodrow Derenberger at Route 47 and I-77 near Mineral Wells. So it creates quite a storm of controversy, and it's all over. Around this time, John Keel is traveling the state, and later, 14 days later. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
You
I
didn't want
don't
me
even really want to talk about Keel that much.
Okay.
Just because everyone acquaints.
Okay. We'll stop that, because that wasn't true anyway. Okay. It's only 14 days later in Point Pleasant where this creature is being cited, that the Indrid Cold story is associated with the Mothman. But the Men in Black is also associated with both. So the UFO aspect of the story, for some reason that we aren't really able to explain, seems to have some connection to the Mothman. Trying to see if I can remember anything else that I'm leaving. Virginia, am I leaving anything out? Lee? Oh, yeah. Oh, I'll go into this part too. The interesting thing about this story too, if you listen to some of these live interviews with Woodrow Derenberger that still exist, that were given to me by Glenn Wilson, one of the interviewers from WTAP TV here in Parkersburg, is how truly frightened he was when you listen to the interviews. And one of the things that seemed to frighten Woodrow Derenberger the most was when Indrid Cold says at the end of his first visitation, his first contact, because later Woodrow Derenberger claimed that he had many contacts with Indrid Cold, many. Glenn Wilson says on these taped interviews, Mr. Derenberger, if Indrid Cold said to you, "Do not be afraid, I mean you no harm," and he was very pleasant with you throughout his conversation, why is it, Mr. Derenberger, that you still seem to be so frightened? He said, because Indrid Cold said to me, "I will see you again. And that's what I am afraid of." And I thought that was very interesting. And later, Woodrow Derenberger did say he had contact with Indrid Cold, that he came back to visit with him. And he not only came back to visit with him, he began to claim that he had a mental telepathy relationship and communication with Indrid Cold. And here in the area, there's a place called Bogle Ridge that he claimed that he would go up and meet Indrid Cold and go visit with him and go on his spaceship, and they would take these rides into outer space. And people would go up onto Bogle Ridge to watch the spaceships come down. I guess this is what couples would do on weekends, is go up on Bogle Ridge and wait for the spaceships to come down. And some people claim that they actually saw some of these spaceships up on Bogle Ridge. And it's kind of interesting that in the area of Mineral Wells, here near Parkersburg, there are still a lot of UFO sightings in that area. I found one on the internet recently from 1998. There was a sighting by a truck driver in the Mineral Wells area. Yeah.
I'm going to go back and add some things we talked about just to make sure I covered them. So Woodrow was kind of by all means like an everyday person. Can you just tell me, like, was he well educated? What kind of education did he have? What type of person was he prior to the encounters? Just to establish how kind of like the details of his stories that he later told kind of didn't fit the mold of what a man of his nature would even kind of make up. Where it's kind of like, you think someone, if they're going to make up a story, makes up like an alien with tentacles and with, green. It's like his story was.
Why did he not make tentacles and that sort of thing?
Going to make up,
exactly.
Based on his kind of, education, who he was. Kind of
exactly.
I think.
Why would he have not made up something?
I would assume that it's going to be a more indulged story. And really, it's not really that fascinating. So it's almost kind of like, I think it lends to the credibility of the story where it's not kind of far-fetched stories. Just
did Mr. Partridge tell you the one about the spaceship that went over when he was on the, did he tell you about the spaceship he saw?
Yes.
Okay. Was it the one that was gray and without the lights?
Yeah.
That was pretty similar to Woodrow's. Yeah. Okay. Let's go into that. Okay. Yeah. All righty.
Tell me a little bit about, because I think
how it is not okay. I'll tell this.
I guess maybe it's a little more.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. It depends on what side of the bed I wake up on, but okay. Because this is kind of like my obsession. This is one of my lifelong obsessions. I know what you're saying.
And then also just the fact that, an everyday
I can't imagine
salesman just all of a sudden
right.
wants to
I
make
can't
up a story. It kind of doesn't
exactly. I can't imagine why anyone would do this. I see where you're going, and I feel the same way.
And it can be like, tell me like it can even be like Woodrow was, an average man.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you know what his educational background was.
He didn't have much. So, you can do. Have you listened to the CD? Oh, you need to.
Yeah, he didn't. He wasn't educated. So
no.
With that in mind, someone who's going to kind of make up a story,
exactly,
make it up even more interesting.
Yeah.
And then also, why would he?
Right. Okay. Woodrow Derenberger was a man that was not college educated, and his particular encounter with Indrid Cold did not have the Hollywood movie kind of aspect to it, where you would see lights. For instance, one of the interesting things that he said, he described the spacecraft as not having any lights on, as being dark gray, shaped like a chimney lamp. And he said he never saw any lights on until that hatch opened. That was the only time he saw any lights at all. Also, he described Indrid Cold as looking like any ordinary man you would see on the street, but dressed in black. And he didn't, it wasn't like a Hollywood 1950s space monster kind of deal. He described him as just a man, a 6 foot tall man who weighed 185 pounds. If someone was going to tell you a story about a spacecraft and a space alien, I would think that they would make up something that would sound a lot more Hollywood, with bright flashing lights and something that would look like a saucer, right? That would look like a saucer. And something that would have buggy eyes, or it would be green. He described it as being charcoal gray with no lights, and the man as looking like a human being. But I think Indrid Cold, in his description, pretty well fits the criteria of your Man in Black description, because he had kind of like the Man in Black with the olive complexion, the dark black coat, the dark hair. So not knowing about what a Man in Black was supposed to look like, and the beaming smile, the communication through mental telepathy. So it doesn't fit it doesn't sound like something a person would make up.
Great. That's exactly what I wanted to come. Can you tell me, Woodrow Derenberger had actually multiple sites. It wasn't like a one-time thing. It almost became like a lifestyle for him. Can you tell me how he had multiple sightings and how they almost became routine? And just kind of tell me what was happening.
Well, truthfully, what was happening with Woodrow Derenberger is he was experiencing a nervous breakdown. And this happens to contactees because they experience something the rest of us haven't experienced. And when this happens, who can you tell? Who can understand what you're going through? I think a lot of, as far as Indrid Cold coming to visit him on the farm or him meeting Indrid Cold on Bogle Ridge, I don't know. I can't tell you whether that happened or not. Whether Indrid Cold was communicating with Mr. Derenberger through mental telepathy, I cannot say. I wasn't there. Even his family, they don't know for sure. I think it's highly possible that was going on. I do know that Mr. Derenberger eventually moved away to escape his past. And he lived away from this area for a long, long time and eventually moved back and passed away back in 1990. Whether he ever made peace with his experiences with Indrid Cold, I don't know. I hope he did.
And let me ask you, not actually from your own point of view or your own opinion on it, but the rumor is that that Indrid Cold tells Woodrow Derenberger that I'll see you again, and that he does come back several times. Not necessarily from your own opinion, but can you just tell me that maybe it's popular belief that Indrid Cold tells Woodrow Derenberger that I'll be back, and many believe that he did return, and there were multiple kind of interactions between.
Indrid Cold said, I will see you again, or we will see you again. That's actually what he actually said. We will see you again. And he did come back and he did visit with Woodrow Derenberger. I'm sorry, say that again.
I was just saying, it's kind of, Indrid Cold, when he first meets Woodrow Derenberger, kind of says, I'm going to see you again. And it's popular belief that he did return on multiple cases. What I'm trying to get is just that, it's believed by many that there were, it wasn't just a one-time thing.
Yeah, it was never witnessed, though.
Right.
He doesn't have a witness to it.
That's okay.
Okay, you want me just to paraphrase what you said?
Well, yeah, that's fine. But I'm saying, so it doesn't sound like your own opinion. That way you're not saying it as fact. We can say, it's popular belief.
Okay.
Or rumor has it.
Okay.
We're letting it kind of broadly.
Okay.
That's kind of like the red.
Okay. When during the initial contact, with Indrid Cold on November 2nd, 1966. Is that picking that up? I'm sorry, we're next to the kitchen. Okay.
Yeah. That's about. Yeah.
Okay.
So we're saying
after the initial contact with Indrid Cold on November 2nd, 1966, after he ended the conversation with Woodrow Derenberger as I will see you again or we will see you again, many believe and legend has it that Indrid Cold did return to visit Woodrow Derenberger. And there was even one case where Mr. Derenberger disappeared for 6 months and said that he was with Indrid Cold. And this is what members of his family believed. So whether he was with Indrid Cold, we don't really know. But some still say that he did have visits with Indrid Cold.
Okay, great. Yeah, I might ask you some questions like that where it's not necessarily like getting your opinion on it, but just kind of like progressing the story.
I see. Yeah, I know how.
I should have told you that.
I don't think anyone but Woodrow saw him.
Yeah, that's cool. But I should have told you that before, that some of them will be more like, just to progress the
right.
story.
Yeah, I know. Although I did have a guy named Billy that was following me around there for a while that looked a lot like Indrid Cold. Yeah. He used to come on the ghost tour all the time when we played the tapes.
Let's see.
And when we stopped playing the tapes, he never came back.
Start playing them again and see.
I know. I know. Just when I started to prepare myself, I'm going to bring my camera and take a picture of him. Never showed up again.
This podcast is a companion piece to the original feature-length documentary film from 2011 of the same title. If you're enjoying this podcast, we encourage you to see the film that started it all by visiting www.eyesofthemothman.com.
I'm not sure if you know this part of the kind of the myth of the Derenberger story here, but on the night of the first encounter, I've read in different places that it's actually one interesting thing about the night of the first encounter is that it can actually kind of be substantiated by other people. Like I heard that, after the kind of reached the newspaper, there were people that said, well, yeah, I drove by this person.
Yes.
Saw him talking to someone. There was also someone who said, I saw some weird lights in the sky in the area that would have been where this happened. So can you tell me a little bit about that? Kind of one of the interesting things about the first night, it can almost kind of be backed up a little bit by some other people.
Yeah, there was, but I can't remember who the person was that saw him talking. The one that I remember, and I can't.
If you get names, I don't even care about the names.
Okay.
Just what I'm trying to get at is just that, he wasn't, it can almost be backed up a little bit.
Okay. There's a couple of them I can remember.
We can just name them like vaguely in a broad sense of what people later came forward and said and help kind of support.
Also, there's a couple of them I can recall. During his conversation with Indrid Cold, the interesting thing that happened was the spaceship had shot up to about 25 feet in the air and it was misting. A light rain. It was very misty that night. You couldn't see that well. But there were people that had passed by in cars that would later report that they saw Mr. Derenberger stop there along the highway talking to a man who fit the description of Indrid Cold. There was also another person who said that he was driving along earlier in the evening, an older man that said there was a man who fit the description of Indrid Cold that was trying to wave him down to stop his car, but he was afraid to stop. And so there were people who actually, who saw Mr. Derenberger talking to a man who very well fit the description of Indrid Cold, which kind of substantiates his report of Indrid Cold.
Great. It's kind of thinking different question, not really related to the story at all, but just from the perspective of someone connected with the psychic world. Can you tell me a little bit about like what channeling is, the term channeling within that world, or just the idea of communication through the mind?
Okay, channeling. Well, channeling spirits, it's a little bit different than intuitive mediumship. Channeling is kind of linking up with the spirit world and kind of letting them come into your body and letting them speak through you. Intuitive mediumship is kind of what I do, and that's picking up things as a blueprint in the atmosphere. So that's sort of what I do, and that is picking up the energy, the information in the atmosphere and interpreting it. So it's a little bit different than channeling.
Okay. Okay. So would you classify kind of what Woodrow Derenberger was experiencing with Indrid Cold in terms of like the mental communication with kind of a higher being? Would that fall under like channeling, or what would that be considered? Is there like a term that would be good to kind of?
I would consider that a psychic imposition.
Okay. Can you go into that a bit? Because, kind of what Woodrow Derenberger was experiencing, in my area study would be called.
Well, I think Indrid Cold was definitely a physical being. I'm not so sure the Mothman is. I think he might be an interdimensional being. I mean, we get into questions about dimensions. But since the idea that other people actually saw Indrid Cold was kind of classified as he would have had to have been something physical, that doesn't mean he couldn't have moved between dimensions. The Mothman, there's a lot of indications that he would would have been, since he was witnessed by different people, that he would be physical as well, but there would be a possibility that they could move through dimensions. But since they had multiple witnesses, they would have to be some kind of a physical being to be seen by so many at the same time. Usually, in terms of spirits and ghosts, sometimes they can be seen by a crowd of people, but usually, most of the time, in terms of ghost, spirits and that kind of thing, they're not usually seen by a crowd of people. Maybe only one person will have a communication with a ghost or spirit. The rest of the crowd of people don't. So I think in Indrid Cold's situation, he sort of imposed himself upon Mr. Derenberger. So that would lead me to believe it was not so much a psychic thing, that it was like you and I talking.
Can you tell me about how the experiences with Indrid Cold actually didn't really benefit Woodrow themselves, but kind of ruined it? Can you talk about that? A lot of people, when they first hear it, think, oh, well, he did for all the fun. And it's like, well, he didn't really experience much of that. It actually kind of ruined his life. Can you talk about some of the setbacks that it did that actually hindered him?
During the time Woodrow Derenberger had his encounter with Indrid Cold, it was of a different time period. Even though it was 1966 and the world was beginning to open up to new ideas and people were traveling to India and linking up with gurus and people were becoming more interested in psychic things, it still was something that people made fun of. So he had to endure a certain amount of ridicule. So he was ridiculed by a lot of people in this community. And that wasn't fun, for people to think that you were some kind of either a lunatic or a crazy person or a pathological liar. So he had to live with both of those names, those slanderous names. So that's not fun. So that would be difficult. So eventually he had to move away from the community and start a new life. And when people think you're a lunatic or you're a liar and you have to live with those labels, no one believes you, or they think you're lying on purpose, that's going to do something to you. So it wasn't fun after that.
I'm going to ask you a similar question. In this one, I'm going to just try for a different response. Same type of thing. Can you tell me a little bit about how Woodrow Derenberger, actually suffered a lot of strife from this? He it wasn't all prosperous and great times. He actually suffered a lot of setbacks. What I wanted this time is if we can just kind of like list off those setbacks. The names, and people called him names. He got, his reputation kind of got tainted. People thought he was crazy. People did that. And also I had heard that, he eventually got a divorce, and it was difficult on his family, on his job. I also heard that maybe he lost his job. So if we can kind of go into that and then list the things, the repercussions that he experienced, like the name calling, the bad reputation, the family, the job, and then eventually ending it with moving out of town completely.
Yeah. It's kind of difficult because I worry about his family seeing this. I'll try as best I can. It kind of reminds me of that Sam Sheppard case. When Sam Sheppard, where the guy they thought he murdered his wife. Did you ever,
which part do you think that might take minutes?
I don't know. Let me try to think about this, because I'm trying to think about his son still lives here in Parkersburg. Tanya has moved away. She's got MS and she's moved back to, they lived in Cleveland for a while, but she's moved back to, which is odd because, she's has the terrible headaches. She's up in Cleveland. But let me think how I'm going to go through this.
What I'm trying to do is just...
Yeah, I understand. I'm trying to think. Well, there's things that, there's things that are embarrassing to them.
Right. I mean,
One thing he thought he was pregnant for a while. That was one thing
I just wanted to show that that it hurt him more than it helped him, and then kind of list some examples of how.
I know, but how do we go about doing this without embarrassing them?
Maybe we can just say like Woodrow, Derenberger.
She called me for a while. The first thing that happened, we used to do this story on the ghost tour, and she called me. And she said, I don't want you telling that story. That embarrasses us. I thought, okay. We dropped it for a while. And then the Mothman prophecies were coming up. And I thought, well, I got to tell this.
Let me know you now. Yeah.
What can you do now?
Right. It can simply be something like this, where it's just like, Derenberger actually suffered a lot of setbacks because of this later. And we can just say, it affected his profession. It affected his family life. It affected his mental, his everyday life. It can literally, we don't have to go in specific. We can literally just say like, it affected his family. It affected his profession. It affected his, whatever. We can kind of stay vague in terms of like that. Because that way it doesn't really, it's pretty broad.
I know. I mean, like I said, now it's been in the movie that, she's trying to.
Yeah, we can literally just do it that way. If that way it'll kind of cover it. And
I even think his ex-wife is still alive too. Let's see.
Because that's been pretty much it, right? It affected his job, it affected his family life, it affected his reputation.
Yeah.
And, we can do, 3 or 4 of this.
Okay. Well, after the event, Woodrow Derenberger experienced a lot of setbacks. It affected his job. It affected his family. It affected his emotional life. It affected him psychologically. I'm sure it affected his spiritual life. And pretty much the family had to move away from this area. And they didn't return till, I think, around the late 1980s. And I really think it was something that they really wanted to put the past behind them. And until the movie came out, but I don't really think it was something to be ashamed of, because I think in many ways Woodrow Derenberger was a man who was ahead of his time, and he became a part of something that was perhaps embarrassing at first, but actually turned into something that was really quite wonderful and quite amazing, and quite a gift in some ways. And I think it's probably one story in many ways that haunts me almost as much as it haunted Woodrow Derenberger. And I have to say that many times, I think I used to say every day when I got up, I didn't know whether I believed in the story or I didn't. One day I would get up and I believed it. The next day I got up and I didn't believe it. But I think now when I get up, I have to tell you, I believe it. I now believe in the story of Woodrow Derenberger and Indrid Cold. I do believe it.
For the next one too, we don't have to go into this.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you just a little bit about, I kind of wanted to touch on that. It didn't just, when this happened, it didn't just affect him directly, but it affected everyone in his immediate kind of area. It affected his family. It affected all those around him. So we're not going into specifics of what it did to the family or whatever, specific cases. Can you just tell me a little bit about the negative experiences that he suffered afterwards did not just affect him, but affected everyone in his family. It affected his friends, because, I heard with the harassing phone calls and people kind of taunting and stuff, it reached even his closest friends. So can you just, without going into details or anything, just tell me a little bit about how, the negative aspects of this story, the repercussions that Woodrow Derenberger suffered later didn't just hit him, but it affected everyone in his family and even his friends.
Well, the repercussions of this story didn't just affect Woodrow Derenberger in a negative way. It affected his family and his closest friends that came by harassing phone calls and the ridicule and the whispers behind his back. And it just became embarrassing for them all. And he lost a lot of friends because of it. And it wasn't something easy to deal with.
Great. Can you just tell me what Derenberger said? We've covered this. Tell me what Derenberger said that Indrid Cold's physical appearance was. What did Indrid Cold look like?
Indrid Cold, when the ship came down and hovered about 12 inches off the road in front of Mr. Derenberger's truck, a hatch opened and a man stepped out, and he described him as about 6 feet tall. He weighed about 185 pounds. He was approximately 35 years of age. He had an olive-like complexion, dark brown hair. He had broad shoulders. During the conversation, he said to have a beaming smile. Also during the conversation, Mr. Derenberger said that he never saw Indrid Cold's hands at all. He kept his hands under his armpits, which was interesting. He never saw his hands. He had a long, dark trench coat, a black trench coat. And beneath the trench coat, he had like a silvery-like material, like a jumpsuit, or like a silvery type of material that he really couldn't describe what it was. And he just looked ordinary, other than the material.
Okay, so good. We're doing good. Are you okay?
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about just it's kind of a scary story, kind of not so much. I think like one of the scarier aspects of the story is not even so much that like, there's a spaceship and that there's an alien. It's kind of that like, I think the scariest part is like that he described this being as being like humanistic looking. Mm-hmm. It wasn't kind of like, what you'd expect. It almost is like, that's kind of like the most kind of bothersome, I think, aspect of the story. Can you tell me just a little bit about that? I mean, if you believe it, Woodrow Derenberger's story, on the whole, if people believe it, it's kind of like, and it's like there are these people that could be walking amongst us that we don't even know, that are not even, who we think they are. Can you just tell me a little bit about that being kind of maybe some on the. When at first you hear the story, you don't realize, but that's actually maybe like one of the more bothersome aspects of the story.
Yeah, the more bothersome aspect, of course, Indrid Cold could walk among us and look like us and fit in with us, I guess, in a sense like the vampire stories. We can't trust what we see. We can't feel comfortable in a room with what looks like us because, it could turn on us at any minute. I think that's the scariest thing of all. We don't know who we're with. The alien, the person beside us may be the alien that's going to turn on us at any minute. I'm not so sure Indrid Cold was all bad, though.
I'm not sure if you've heard this, and again, this probably wouldn't be from your opinion or perspective, it's just kind of to tell part of the legend and myth behind this kind of thing. One of the kind of more interesting stories that I've heard about Woodrow Derenberger and like the secondary, the third, the fourth kind of encounter with Indrid Cold. So I read somewhere that at some point Woodrow Derenberger actually sought out like a psychiatrist to look him over, just to kind of like for his own peace of mind.
Yeah, I didn't know about that, huh? Well, you want Tanya's email? I mean, I can give it to you. What? Yeah, I'll get that to you. Yeah, she's in Cleveland.
Sorry.
Okay. No, she's up in Cleveland.
2 hours.
Yeah. No, but I mean, hasn't anything happened to you since you started this? We've had all kinds.
Keep track because like I've had so many weird things happen to me like forever. Like that's why I do this stuff.
I mean, I had the Billy follow me around there for a while, and we were at Point Pleasant. We were sitting there with Rosemary Guiley, and some UFO guy, and Virginia had just gotten a new cell phone. And she couldn't play back her recordings. And finally she learned how to, the person calling was like from 11111.
Yeah.
She played it back and it said, "Hi." No, listen, there was no one that knew her number. And I laughed and said it was Indrid Cold. One night, like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, I picked up the phone, same voice saying, "Hi."
Well, don't tell me what I want to happen to me.
Hi. I star 69 my phone. It was a number in Point Pleasant. I know no one down there except Jeff Walmsley. I can barely go to. I'll go with you, but I mean, I get a headache every time I'm in Point. I only know Jeff. Well, the number was Point Pleasant, but it had been disconnected.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, I've always had weird stuff.
It's going to happen. I mean, you're doing this documentary. It's going to start.
Is it just going to be him, or is it going to involve all?
Oh, it should. It's going to start.
I've always had weird stuff. I've always kind of been into like weird things because I've always kind of, just even since I was little, I've always seen stuff. I've always heard stuff. I've always been like very, just evolved. I've just seen weird stuff forever since I was little. And I can name definite things that have happened since I've done this. I mean, as far back as like a year and a half ago when I first started research for this thing. I mean,
you haven't gotten any.
I'll tell you really quick. This one thing that really weird happened to me. I was researching to start this thing, like literally maybe like 2 years ago. And I was reading. I was in a car. I was working for the show The Apprentice with Donald Trump, like the first year came out. I was working on that show, and I was sitting in a car in New York. And I was reading, like research and writing stuff, and like sitting in this car waiting while these people were filming and something. And it was so weird. It was the weirdest feeling. Like I fell asleep for like, it couldn't have been more than like 4 minutes, 3 minutes, something like that. And it was like I wasn't tired. I just fell asleep. And then like 3 seconds later, like something like my car was like had moved. Like I woke up because the car was kind of rocking. And I thought a guy hit my car and drove by, and I went outside and it was like a huge like scratch against my car. Mm-hmm. And it's not my car, so I have to report it to the people I'm working for. But it was like the most bizarre feeling because like I'll ask you these last few, and then we'll go into anything that you can say.
Okay, all right.
Can you just tell me? I know we've already talked about it, but how does like the story of Woodrow Derenberger end? What happens?
I don't know. It ends as life does.
He feels he after a while. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the paranoia, because he did have some paranoia, right? I heard that he thought he was being watched. He thought that like his mail was being tampered with. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I don't know about that. Okay. No. That's his life. It's his life is. I think it just finally just petered out. It just like.
Can you tell me that? The story of Woodrow Derenberger kind of ends just like life does, something like that.
I don't know. I mean, that's the point.
Just say it. Just
okay. He died. Last night I was doing. We're getting ready to do a ghost hunt this weekend. I know where he's buried. I was looking up. He died in May of 1990.
What was the date?
It's like the 3rd, I think, but I'm not real sure. I think it's like May 3rd. What's today? It's the 1st. May 3rd, 1990, I think is when he died. Yeah, I was looking at his gravestone. He's buried in Mineral Wells is where he's buried, yeah. I think, let's see.
If you can just tell me, how does this story end? You don't have to go into specifics, but if you can just tell me, the story of Woodrow Derenberger ends just, like you said, I think
unresolved. Woodrow Derenberger's stories ends as most lives end, unresolved, without answers. Mystery, unsolved. No answer.
In terms of just all the things that were going on in Point Pleasant, like there were UFOs, there was the Mothman, there was this, not too far away. Can you tell me, do you think that collective mystery will ever be solved, or is this kind of like a case that's kind of too complex, to be figured out by the rational human mind? Is these things that are kind of over our head this is like larger than life? Are these incidents that we're talking about are they beyond our understanding? Will this mystery ever kind of be resolved? Okay.
I think there are so many levels to the Mothman Indrid Cold story. I don't really think that these will ever be solved or revealed in our lifetimes. I think they're rich. There are layers. One doorway leads to another doorway, and I don't really think that they will be solved in our lifetimes. And I think that's sort of the fascination and the beauty of these stories. That's why there's never any answers. There's never any resolution to these stories. And that's why I think people keep coming back to them.
Great. Do you have an opinion on all this? The meaning and purpose of what this all, do you have any opinion?
I don't.
Okay. do people often look to you for an opinion just because, you do psychic work and things like that? Do people automatically think that, you have maybe this superior knowledge? Do you get that a lot? Of people wanting to know what the meaning of this is, and you're just like...
They shouldn't.
Does that happen to you a lot, though, or no?
Well, I have I suppose I have a certain knowledge of this field, but I don't think I have answers. I don't think knowledge and answers are the same thing. As I said, I think one doorway leads to another, and it's infinity. I mean, there's never a stop to this, and I think that's the beauty of it all. That's the beauty of every mystery, and I think the Mothman continues to fascinate because of that. It's a true American mystery, and that's why there continues this fascination with this particular American story.
Great. Okay, that's all my questions.
Okay.
Is there anything that you want to add that I forgot that's important?
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't go into a lot of Mothman stuff with you.
Well,
we're going to change tape.
Okay.
So we can... Okay, so we're already going to go into some of those stories that
okay.
Anything I left out.
All right. Okay.
Should I smile at the
Okay. Want me to just go ahead and start?
Yeah, and just talk.
Okay. Well, I grew up very close to the first Mothman sighting, or the first Mothman incident, which was the Partridge sighting in Doddridge County, West Virginia, which was near a small community called Center Point. At one time, my grandmother was the postmistress of Center Point, and I lived in the small town of West Union, West Virginia, and we were about 2 or 3 hills away from the Partridge family. And I went to school with Roger Partridge. And I remember, this tells how old I am, but I remember the incident of Roger coming to school, telling the story about, Bandit and the red eyes in the barn, or the lights in the barn. But our house during that time was undergoing some really interesting activity. It was an old house. And the interesting thing about this house is it had undergone some strange activity previous to us living in this house, and this was long before 1966. This house, a few years before we moved into it, there was another family that lived in this house that began to hear footsteps, human footsteps on the roof. There was a young lady that babysat in this house, and she heard these human footsteps on the roof of the house. And she became so frightened of these footsteps that she called the police. And the police came to this house, and they saw these muddy footsteps going up the side of the house, all the way up the side of the house onto the roof. And it was never solved what these man-like footsteps were on the house. And later, I was very small. Later, our family moved in. And lo and behold, of course, in 1966, the Mothman sightings began. And at that time, I was a very sensitive child, and I noticed everything. I also suffered from insomnia. I would lay awake at night. And during the night, I would hear about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and keep in mind, this was like a few hills away from the Partridge family. It would sound like someone had jumped out of an airplane, and you would hear someone land on our roof at night. And for 2 or 3 minutes, it would sound like this person would pause for 2 or 3 minutes. And then they would start to walk on the roof. They would walk around on the roof, pause for a little while, and this would go on for about 10, 15 minutes, and it would stop as if the person or the thing or the being would fly away. This probably went on between 1966 going into 1967, maybe 1970. It went on for a long, long time. And I would listen to this all the time. It was constant. Also during this time, our house began to be plagued by intense poltergeist activity. Things would fly around the house, pictures would fly off the walls. And we also began to experience the very same thing that the Partridge family, the Merle Partridge family would have. We would have this strange, the picture would go off our television set. And we would have this strange whining and groaning and these very strange sounds come across our television set. And this continued from 1966, 1967, until it almost stopped completely back in 1970. And about 1970, all of this strange activity stopped about completely. So it seemed to me that the activity in this particular little house, it was the highest house on the hill. It was called Shannon's Knob. And after this activity in 1967, my friend Jeannie and I went up to play on the hillside, up in the woods. So one day we were playing up on the hillside, and suddenly we saw these two men dressed in black. They were dressed completely in black. And there was something about these men that we knew to be afraid of. So we began to hide in the bushes. Now, the one man looked completely ordinary. He just looked like an ordinary man dressed in dark clothing. The other man looked different. He looked to me sort of like, he looked mixed race. He looked partly Asian in some way. And he had on just like a black shirt and black pants. Now, he looked part Asian, but he looked like he had his hair dyed like a blonde color. So we watched them from the bushes. We sat and watched them from the bushes. We watched them for a little while. And at that time, they were playing these spy shows on television. So we were very small children, so we thought that they were spies. So we watched them. Finally, we went home and forgot about them. A couple of days later, some kids at school told us they saw a flying saucer over our house. They had seen this flying saucer or the spaceship that was hovering over my house. A few days later, we went up on the hillside and we saw these two men in black. We saw this big circular-like impression in the ground where these men had been measuring. The interesting thing about my friend Jeannie and I, where we had saw these two men in black, is when we got into adulthood, we were both plagued with these terrible, terrible migraine headaches, which we still both have. We still both have these terrible headaches. And we forgot about these men in black. I mean, it completely left our minds. It was not until years later I began to read about these men in black, and this memory came back to me. So I called up my friend Jeannie, and I wanted to see if she remembered about seeing these men in black. And she remembered this. So later, I was doing some research on the men in black, and I read about Albert Bender, and he was the first one to write about the men in black. And I read how the reason that he had stopped doing all this research on the men in black was because of these headaches that he started having. And even until this day, I still have these headaches, and so does Jeannie. She still has these headaches. And these are still a terrible medical problem that we both still have. So we did have these encounters with the men in black. Yeah, very weird. And Tanya Derenberger, she also has these headaches. I always get headaches in Point Pleasant. I'm going to go anyway, though. I'm so psyched about doing the walkthrough.
Okay, yeah, that'll be cool.
But when I met John Keel, I had the worst headache of my entire life. Yes, it was hideous. Okay.
Well, is there anything you think else that we...
No, I just thought you wanted that story, didn't you?
Yeah, that was great. All right, you did a great job.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Well, thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Eyes of the Mothman, the podcast. For more information about our program, or to find out where you can watch the original documentary film or purchase a limited edition signed DVD copy, please visit www.eyesofthemothman.com.